Volair has finally released a new line of paddles to succeed their extremely popular Mach 1 and Mach 2 Forza. Today we talk about the brand new Volair Control 1 and 2 Forza. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. So it's been a while since the Mach 1 and Mach 2 Forza came out, and as good as those paddles still are, it was probably time for an update with all the new tech that's come out since then. Those are fantastic raw carbon thermoform paddles, some of the best on the market right now, especially in terms of spin and control, but when I saw the Forza 1 and 2 shapes with Kevlar top sheets, I got pretty excited. I've been a huge fan of Kevlar since I first tested it on the Proline Energy S and the Ruby, so I couldn't wait to get my hands on these. But I do have to admit, it's been about a year since Kevlar was first introduced, so they are a little bit late to the party. Still, better late than never, and I do think Kevlar is one of those materials like carbon that's going to stay quite timeless in pickleball, and I'm actually going to compare these new controls to the Mach 1 and 2 throughout this review. Now, of course, before we get into any of that, let me remind you that any of the paddles we talk about on this channel you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. Now let's get right into the specs, and I'll be talking about both the Control 1 and the Control 2 Forza today. The Control 1 weighs 8.1 ounces, and surprisingly, it's 16.35 inches long. Now, when I first saw that length, I was really caught off guard because it has the same general shape as an arrow curve elongated paddle, and it's 7.5 inches wide. But then when you put it side by side with the Mach 1 Forza, you can tell it's undeniably a little bit shorter. Technically, Volair also have the Mach 1 at 16.35 inches long, but that's just not the case. This paddle is 16.5 inches long. You can tell here side by side with the Bantam, it's the same length, if not maybe even a little bit longer. Now, I only found out this paddle was 16.35 inches long after my playtest when I looked at the spec sheet, and I'll tell you right now, I did not feel a major difference on court. In terms of swing pattern, leverage, spin, power, and maneuverability, this plays exactly like what you would expect from an elongated paddle. The only thing I felt that I thought could maybe be down to the slightly shorter shape was sweet spot size, which I will touch on later. The rest of the specs are pretty standard. It's 16 millimeters thick, it has a 5.5 inch handle, a 1/16 swing weight, and a 6.35 twist weight. The Control 2 Forza is shaped identically to the Mach 2 Forza. It's 15.88 inches long, it's 16 millimeters thick with a 5.5 inch handle. It also weighs 8.1 ounces with a 110 swing weight and a 7.32 twist weight. Now, like I just said, in terms of shape, these two paddles are identical. And I know that's going to make a lot of people very happy because this was one of the most popular wide body long handle paddles for a very long time. Now, I'm also going to admit that whatever differences there are between the controls and the Machs are very subtle, which is definitely not a bad thing, and they can all be traced back to the main design difference, Kevlar versus carbon. I'll elaborate on this once we get into more specific playability characteristics, but the key to remember throughout this review is that Kevlar is more dynamic than carbon. That means that Kevlar is more plush on soft shots and also slightly springier on powerful shots. It's that plush element that gives these paddles their control name. But now let's talk about how all this theory translates onto the court, starting as usual with ball feel. Right away, you can tell that there is a bit more to the pocketing on the Control Forzas. Kevlar adds this subtle layer of plushness to the dwell time, but I do have to say, on these paddles in particular, it is more subtle than most. Now, initially I thought, okay, well, I'm testing these paddles in pretty cold temperatures, so maybe that's why that plush feel isn't as pronounced. But I planned for that dilemma. I brought out the Honolulu Pickleball J2K, and this just has a bit more of that Kevlar effect during dwell time. I think this has something to do with the fact that Volair Control's Kevlar top sheet is not the same maroon color as the Ruby and the J2K, because I've felt this slightly different dwell time on the 11.624 Kevlar paddles and on the Honolulu Pickleball blue Kevlar paddles. They just don't feel quite as plush as the red Kevlar top sheets. I want to conduct a more thorough test to prove this at some point, but for example, in tennis, if you use a different colored dye in a string, that changes its playability as well. I also find that these Control Forzas don't have quite as premium and rich of a feel as the J2K and the Ruby. This is another huge benefit to Kevlar top sheets. That richness tends to improve your connection to the ball with what I like to call good feel, and that just heightens your sensation of control. Here, that feel is a tiny bit more jarring, leading to some negative vibrations and a more disconnected feel feel, and this was the case on both the Control 1 and the Control 2 Forzas. I do kind of wish we'd gotten a maroon top sheet version of these paddles, but I want to make it clear this is being super nitpicky. The feel is still excellent here, and yes, it is the major difference between these and the Machs. Of course, this Kevlar top sheet, because it's dynamic, also gives these paddles a bit more spring in the power game. Carbon is more raw and hollow and just generally feels a little bit more thuddy than Kevlar, which is why it doesn't go quite as soft for control and also doesn't seem to activate for more pop and power. I will get into this more in the power and control section, but I do generally prefer the adaptability that Kevlar provides because I think it helps to make paddles more well-rounded, but these aren't quite as impressive as some of the other Kevlar paddles I've tested. That jarring sensation takes away a little bit of that positive feel that makes Kevlar paddles so good, and this also has a slightly negative effect on sweet spot performance. Of course, another major benefit to Kevlar paddles is that they do tend to have slightly larger sweet spots than carbon face paddles. That plush feel expands the sweet spot to make the paddle face more forgiving outside of it, and that's certainly the case here, although again, not quite to the extent of some other paddles I've tested. Now, it is important to remember that the Control 1 Forza is shorter than pretty much every other elongated paddle, and that could definitely play its part in making the sweet spot feel smaller. Shorter means less stability and therefore a smaller feeling sweet spot. You can always expand it a little bit with lead tape, although I wasn't able to experiment with this since I did have to cut my playtest short because my ankle injury flared up near the end. I would really want to try some lead on this paddle at some point though, especially adding some at the tip to make it effectively play a little bit longer, and this would also make it feel a little bit more plush because you've got more mass crushing into the ball. Now, the Control 2 sweet spot is obviously huge. This is one of the major benefits you get with wide body paddles, and yes, it is noticeably bigger than the Mach 2s, which does provide a real benefit in the control game. The best way to explain how these paddles compare in terms of power and control to the Mach Forzas is by really hammering home that dynamic playability of Kevlar, which is why I spent so much time talking about how these paddles actually feel on contact. At its core, Kevlar is both more powerful and more controlled. That's just the reality of its dynamic playability. I know it might sound a little bit too good to be true, but that's why Kevlar was able to take such a big dent out of the popularity of raw carbon paddles. So that sounds great on paper. The issue with dynamic playability is that it is by definition inconsistent. When a paddle responds differently on different types of shots, it is simply less consistent than paddles that don't. Now, if you have tried the best Kevlar paddles, like the J2K and the Ruby that I just mentioned, you're probably sitting there thinking, wait, what? Those paddles aren't inconsistent at all. And that's true, but that's because those paddles have incredible feel. Good feel gives you a connection to the ball that makes you understand exactly where it's going to go when it shoots off the paddle face, and this gives you confidence in your paddle. The best Kevlar paddles have that rich feel, and because it's not quite as pronounced here, I do find both the Control 1 and 2 Forza to be slightly less consistent in the control game. The way the ball launches is just that little bit more ambiguous, especially in the mid-court control game where that confidence-inducing feel is so crucial. Again, lead tape would help to increase dwell time and it would make both these paddles more consistent, but still, I don't think they're quite on the level of the best Kevlar paddles. Are they better for control than the Mach 1 and 2 though? In my opinion, yes. Now, this is definitely going to be more of a personal preference type thing, but I do find that because these are a little bit more plush, they do help you to guide the ball a little bit more. This is also exactly why Volair is calling these control paddles, by the way, and I can completely understand that, but I know a lot of players find the Mach 1 and 2 Forzas to be elite control paddles, and I definitely wouldn't argue that. If anything, those are a little bit more consistent, which kind of evens the scale back and makes up for the fact they aren't quite as soft. Between the Control 1 and 2, the 2 is definitely better in the control game, or at least easier to control. The wider sweet spot makes it more forgiving, which is great when you're dinking in the kitchen, and this shape is much more maneuverable than the Control 1 shape, which makes it better for deceptive touch shots because you can quickly change direction. Ironically, I find that these are both considerably better than the Mach 1 and 2 in the power game. To me, there's a bigger difference in their performance here than there is for control. This is again down to that spring effect that Kevlar provides. It does just add a slight kick to your shot that helps for both power from the baseline and for pop at the net. Now, I do need to clarify here, this is nowhere near as intense as the spring effect that foam provides in the power game. It goes back to what I was saying earlier about the Mach paddles and the control paddles. That spring effect is extremely subtle. In fact, I find the actual difference in feel to be more obvious than whatever slight increase in velocity the ball has coming off the paddle. The truth is, both the controls and the Machs are quite powerful, but nowhere near as powerful as true power paddles. They're comparable to paddles like the J2K and the Ruby that I keep mentioning, as well as some other dynamic paddles like the Rhombus Novas and the Pickleball Apes Pulse paddles. This slight bump in power applies to both the Control 1 and Control 2. The 2 will be better for pop at the net because it's easier to generate quick paddle head speed with, and the 1 is better for power because it's more stable and has more leverage, which complements a big swing. I'm going to preface this spin section by saying spin is top tier on both these paddles. They're competitive with the best spin paddles on the market right now. However, I don't consider them the best or even in the top 5. Now, one of the major benefits you get with a Kevlar top sheet is that it makes a paddle competitive both in top end spin, so spin on serves and drives, and in the soft spin game. When you combine the plusher overall feel with extremely high grit, it creates this sensation of unmatched control over how much spin you can put on your shot, no matter the situation. Basically, you feel the ball sink into the face a little more, so you have time to generate high spin even when you're not hitting super hard by grabbing the ball with that dwell time. This is what we call spin modulation. Thank you to my good friend Beckett, who runs the 10Com review channel, for helping me out with that term. And Kevlar has better spin modulation than carbon because of its plusher feel. The issue with both the Control 1 and 2 is that because this Kevlar top sheet isn't quite as soft and doesn't feel as good as some others, I just don't have that same confidence in the spin game. They're still excellent, especially in the top end spin game where that modulation is less important, but they're not quite as responsive to my input when I'm hitting really technical spin shots. Still, we all know how spin friendly the Mach 1 and 2 Forza are. These are similar, but with just a little bit more variety all around the court, so think these plus a little bit more. There is one thing I want to make abundantly clear with these Volair control paddles. They're not that different from the Mach 1 and 2 that they evolved from. The key difference here is going to be how each individual responds to those differences in terms of feel. Personally, I know Kevlar paddles aren't that much better than raw carbon paddles, but I've always played better with them because they leave me a little bit more connected to the ball and therefore more confident in the paddle. That's the case here between the Mach 1 and 2 and the Control 1 and 2, although I will say I don't think the difference is quite as obvious as if we were to compare something like the J2K and the Carbon J2. I think it could have helped to further emphasize those differences if they had used a slightly better Kevlar top sheet here, and really the change could be as easy as opting for a red one instead of the green one here. Now, I think these paddles are great because while they're not that different to the Mach 1 and 2 Forzas, they're perfect for players who like those paddles, also like the unique playability of Kevlar, and want a blend of the two. If that's you, I can confidently say that you will be very happy if you go for these. They are fantastic all-court paddles that Volair was definitely right to add to their line, if maybe a little bit late in doing so. With that said, that is going to be the end of this review. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you want to demo either of these, you can come visit us in-store, or if you want to buy them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.